trying to think where to start. So I think one thing to start with is you mentioned in the article this like meeting you had with your husband, right? Where you're like, let's plan this thing out. Like,
Mm,
what are we prioritizing? Like, how are we structuring our lives? And I would be very curious as much as you can remember how you approached that conversation, maybe the path you walked down and came back on. Um,
yeah.
help someone understand who like that is a foreign concept of a conversation to have how it works for you.
Right. Okay. So yeah, this is a great place to start because I think a lot of people are not intentional enough with their lives and just in
Mm-hmm.
general. Like I think people kind of just get caught on whatever path they think is um, what is expected of them and don't think really critically about like what do I want out of either like my life as a whole or my goals for my life, like shorter term, medium term, long term, or like what do I want out of this particular period of my life. And so part I would say, well, first of all, I have three kids now who are 11, 8, and 4. And they, before we even had kids, when we first got together and first got married, my husband and I both had various experiences like before we met each other that kind of informed us having this conversation. The first and most important one for me was I was a nanny for
Mm-hmm.
most of my
I
young
wanted to ask
adult,
about that. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, most of my young adulthood, like starting as a teenager, and then I like was a kind of a more professional nanny in my post college years just to fund travel. So I would nanny like significant chunks, like summer usually would be a good time to make a lot of money, and then go on these trips. And when I was nannying, I just got like a sort of crash course in how different families were setting up their home economies. And with a lot of wealthier families who you would think were on the highest end of success, they just never saw their kids. I mean, I was nannying for this one family, very wealthy family. The mom was in real estate, the dad was in finance in Chicago, and they had two nannies. I was one of two. They had a full-time nanny that came from like 8 to 5, and then
Mm-hmm.
I was the 6 to 8 in the morning, and then the 5 to 7 at night nanny. Because that other nanny had kids in daycare, who then like she had to drop off and pick up, and that was like the limit of daycare hours. So then I'm just thinking about like these cascading effects of this other nanny has to put her kids in daycare to be able to care for this other parent's children. And then I'm with no children yet, like picking up the slack. And the kids, they weren't even awake when their parents left, and they were about to go to sleep when their parents came home. And high, super high achieving, going to the fanciest schools in the neighborhood, access to all the greatest extracurriculars and et cetera, et cetera, but almost no relationship with their parents. And like, I mean, just side note, like I know this is very traditional in aristocratic worlds
Mm-hmm.
where like people
Mm-hmm.
like the King of England were just like raised by governesses, etc. But that's not my approach. As a middle class person who grew up in the United States, like being involved with my kids is central to what my goals were for life. So that was just kind of a radicalizing realization that this is kind of what, if you're the highest echelon of success in our society, this is what you do. This is what one does. And so I was like, whatever it takes, I'm not going to do that. Then I like had some other family, friends, and cousins, etc., who were like having babies and then just agonizing over
Mm-hmm.
having to go back to work with a newborn, just agonizing over it. Like, this is just one of the worst things I could ever imagine. Like, I just don't want to leave my baby and I have to, and I feel horrible about it. And then, people just adapt and they get into their schedules and their routines and they just, kind of just deal with it. But just having been around for a few of those families, I noticed and observed, this really painful moment that a lot of women, especially, go through, and new mothers, where they're like, I can't quit my job. I need it for insurance or X, Y, or Z thing. So I have to go back, and really like struggling with that. And then finally, my husband and I both traveled a lot. And my husband is a Spanish teacher and lived abroad in South America. And I traveled a lot and lived abroad. And so just leading up to that conversation, we had all of these different life experiences that kind of informed that, let's make an intentional decision here, but based on like, could we live abroad? What could we do in this period? Like we both agreed that being around our kids when they're little is really important. And then maybe I can talk next about the FIRE movement, which we came across right at that same time.
Oh man, table that, because the subtext to a lot of the interviews or people I speak to who wander down some sort of, I'll call it a non-traditional like lifestyle structure. Often like FIRE is a gateway drug, and then they have some sort of bristling, which I want to get to that. But
yeah,
so there's kind of a subtext to what you described to me, and I want you to tell me if this is accurate, which is you had a chance to almost like A/B test your values in a way. Like you were nannying and you're like, this is what it looks like to prioritize status and money and career accomplishments, right?
Yep.
This is what it looks like. And you were like, this is not my value system. Like,
yep.
To the next one. And I am curious how you and your husband, for lack of a better word, like ranked your values or came to the list of 2 or 3 that were important to you, the tough decisions that happened. Just how did you end in this particular articulation of the things you cared about?
Yeah, so I mean, I think part of it is just like the inexplicable culture that we both were raised in. Like, so it's not necessarily like a rational choice as much as like both of us were raised in families that prioritized children and family over career, both of us. And so my dad was a Chicago fireman, but the firefighter schedule is like 24 hours on and 48 hours off, and they had like, every third shift they have a day off. So he was just around a lot. My mom only worked part-time 2 days a week as a physical therapy assistant. His mom was odd jobs on and off, but mostly stay-at-home mom, and his dad was self-employed as a lawyer, so he could kind of set his own hours and like determine when he would meet with people. And his only real commitments were like being in court at court dates that were not set by him. So both of our families really prioritize that. And I think one thing I like say over and over again is that was very I mean, we were born in 1985, both of us. That was super common in the 80s and 90s, where it was like, it's not like the woman didn't work at all. The moms did work. They did like various gigs and, different part-time things. And a lot of it ebbed and flowed, like, depending on how old the kids were. Like when they were preschool, mom would stay home more, but then they would take work as the kids got older. Like that was just super common. And so we were both raised like that. And I think just both deeply valued it just because we enjoyed like having an active relationship with our parents, as opposed to like being in daycare. We didn't really have experience of being in daycare or having a nanny or having an au pair or anything like that. But it was fundamentally like my parents did it this way, and I think that's the right way. It wasn't really that rational,
Okay.
And then on top of it, I think both of us, like I went to the University of Chicago, which is a pretty fancy school, and then like, eventually got my PhD, and I've seen behind the curtain, like with both nannying, but also like in my various, academic training and that kind of thing, where it's like, I've seen the highest echelons of success, and it doesn't seem that much more meaningful than being able to spend time with your kids. And not that you couldn't still pursue a vocation or like a career broadly, but like just, there's nothing that, I mean, I've heard people say like, you're not going to reach the end of your life and say, I wish I worked more.
Right.
And it's just like, it's kind of it's not a rational thing to say. It's an emotional thing to say.
Do you think something I've batted around with a few people is there's a level of any field or profession, call it your whatever, top 10, top 20%, where you have to be willing to make some degree of sacrifice, which you just described. Like you were saying, like, I will see my kids less because being the dean of whatever at whatever school is like that important to me. And I am, you're like, some of the intonation is like some people like sleepwalk into that, right? Like,
yeah,
making
right.
a conscious decision. Do you agree with that assessment? Like some people are choosing it,
Yes.
but some people kind of back into it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people in general, and this is like probably a very judgmental thing to say, but I think a lot of people are, their priorities are really messed up. And I think there's
Mm.
actually a lot of really, really important downstream effects of this kind of striverist culture,
Yeah.
where striver and success means status and money, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to like the success is the result of my children and how they're raised. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's another form of success that has existed in
Right.
human history. We just don't prioritize it right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people think like they kind of have this like rational technocratic approach to child rearing, like the kids will be fine, like studies say that this is probably fine, like, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
it's fine that I don't spend time with them, like no, there's no studies that say it's not fine. And so you're just kind of like you are kind of like forced. And I also think, like, for example, a lot of people do think it's lower status to stay home with your kids.
Yeah.
You know, they think like you're backwards or you're not taking advantage of your education, or like it's almost like a radical thing to do now, even though it was completely normal just, you know, 30 years ago when I was being raised. So it's
Mm.
like, um, yeah, I don't know. It's just, it's just a matter of values. And I think that a lot of people are just not intentional enough with
Mm.
their goals in life. Like, do you actually, you know, want to raise your own kids or not? Ask yourself that before you have kids. I was just talking
Mm-hmm.
to a young woman who was like, I think in her late 20s, and she was like, you know, I could leave this job that I love and I could try to make more money at like a job that I would hate just to be able to pay for daycare, or I can try to keep this other job and like have a baby and just kind of like ask them if I can manage the baby and the work and do
Yeah.
remote. And I was like, do that. Like, do that other thing. Don't get a job for status and money just to pay for daycare. Like, you don't want that. I'm telling you, you don't. And she was like, yeah, I definitely don't. I just am like, this is what everyone tells you to do.
Do you do you think there are people who earnestly do want that, who have thought about it and said this is worth it to me?
This is like, that's a really tough moral area. Like, I really am pretty libertarian in the sense that I am like, you know, do whatever makes sense for you. This, but I have
Mm-hmm.
very strong opinions about what I did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
However, I do think there is something immoral about something to the furthest extreme of saying, I just had an infant that I grew inside my body who
Mm-hmm.
needs me biologically. And if somebody says, I just don't feel like being with the infant, like a
Mm-hmm.
mother, I feel like there's something immoral about that
Mm-hmm.
personally.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I am not afraid to say that at the most extreme end, like maybe you should feel like it just because that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of your biological
Mm-hmm.
responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't, the in between cases where it's like, you know, you've been with the baby for a while and work is really important to you and you juggle it and you know, meet the baby's needs, and, you know, you like, you're really career focused and you find ways to raise your kids in the best way you possibly can while acknowledging the trade-offs. Like, there's a ton of gray area there. But
Mm-hmm.
I think there is an extreme acceptance of like, I just don't feel like being with my newborn, and
Yeah.
therefore I'm entitled to do whatever I want no matter
Mm.
what kind of responsibilities I have. And I just think that that's actually kind of immoral when you think about
Mm.
it.
So yeah, and there's like something kind of gendered right about some of this too, right? Like to your point about like you're speaking from the woman's perspective, like the baby was literally inside you. I've seen measurements of especially like millennial dads are spending way more time with their kids than
Yeah.
like Gen X and especially Boomer parents did. And I'm curious how gender and gender roles are play into how you approach this kind of approach to your life.
Yeah, I think about that a lot. There's two things. One, I think now having nursed three babies, like
Mm.
baby moms make milk, so that's one thing. And like, and also like, just, you know, I've had this experience a million times myself and with people with babies. It's like the babies know the mom smell, you know,
Mm-hmm.
they like, they do need mom more physically than dad, and the dad
Yeah.
can step in, but it's just not the same. They're just not exactly equivalent, and that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
And good. And you should, as a mother, be like, this isn't a burden. This is empowerment. Like, this is
Mm-hmm.
amazing that I can do this with my body and that the baby needs me so much. Like, right now, my 4-year-old is like, I don't know. There is nothing more pure in the world than the love of like a toddler for their mom,
Mm-hmm.
because you just like want to be with you all the time and they
Mm-hmm.
just love you
Mm-hmm.
so unconditionally and just like it's lovely, you know. Um, Having said that, I think right now the way things are set up, it is so isolating for moms
Mm-hmm.
alone, just because they're the primary one who, you know, the baby, especially infants like under one need. I think if at all possible, and we can talk about what we did, have the dad home too, or have another adult there, because it is so hard to deal with it alone. And the way that we did it, my husband was kind of primary on the older kids, and I would be
Mm-hmm.
primary on the babies.
Mm-hmm.
And that is like a great balance. And it's so
Mm.
helpful because, like, in the past, it would be, you know, it would be groups of children, it would be groups of women. Maybe the men would be doing something like, let's just say in an agricultural society, men would be doing some farm work out near the house, but outside of it. But since we don't have that, I think husbands are a great substitute, but they just work better with the older kids, in my
Mm-hmm.
opinion,
Yeah.
than the infants.
So let's talk about your guy approach. So there was this conscious conversation of what are we prioritizing? Time with our children. Cool. And you seem to have sacrificed some degree of earning or career development to make that. And I've seen in your article you wrote this about as like a mini retirement, or like there's a perceived end date to this prioritization is like
Yep.
implied by the way you talk about this. So I am I would love to know how you. I'm trying to think of the right way to ask this. Like, there's a Earth 2 in your brain where you didn't do this, where you're still getting all the accolades for your career. Maybe your husband is too. And how do you ever think about like what was, or like consider that like loss of status in the eyes of so many people? Like how do you have comfort in this decision because it's
Right.
uniquely you guys?
No, I don't ever second guess it.
Mm.
So that's good.
Mm-hmm.
I don't ever second guess it at all, because I think part of it is that we chose such a weird path, of going to South America for 7 years to be able to
Mm-hmm.
do this, kind of mini retirement. So that itself, led to a kind of unique path, that was interesting for both of our careers. And so I don't regret it. I mean, the time spent together as a family, I'll never regret the time we got to spend in Uruguay and like teach our kids Spanish and, you know, learn how to live off the land. I just won't regret it. It was just such a wonderful
Mm-hmm.
period in our lives. And like now we're back in Chicago, we're back in the grind. I'm just like, do I regret
Oh,
coming
I didn't
here?
realize you were back in Chicago. Okay, I
Yes.
didn't realize that.
Yeah. So
Okay.
I'm back in Chicago, back in the life of, you know, two full-time jobs, kids are at school, everybody's up, everybody's doing stuff.
Oh,
And
okay.
yeah,
All
so
right. This
I'm
this.
the sabbatical is
Oh,
over. The sabbatical is
got it.
over. And so now
Oh.
I'm just like, do I regret doing this?
Oh,
Because the
interesting.
other
Okay.
life was so, it was so peaceful, it was so wonderful. And I think it was the right call, it was the right time, but you know, this is like the grind life now.
Mm. What? Yeah. Why did you feel compelled to go back? Why did you guys? Why
Yeah.
not ride it out? Yeah.
So the initial conversation was always, the sabbatical will be, and this was influenced by fire. The sabbatical will always be when we have kids under three and under.
Got it.
So
So
three is
your
like a big
youngest is 4,
turning
right?
point
Yeah.
for, yeah. So the big is a three is a big turning point for just development for kids, like be away from home, they can go to school, and like, you know, in the US and in Uruguay too, 3 is the start of preschool. And so as they transition into schooling age, which I was kind of on the fence about sending them to school at all and more toward homeschooling, but I've reversed on that, and now I think school is great and important. And I can talk about that if you want.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a period of time where when we left, my oldest was 3, my middle was a newborn baby, and my youngest wasn't born yet. And then when we came back, my oldest is like she's in 5th grade. Middle was in second, and then the youngest was just starting preschool. So we're out of the period where we have any infants at home. And
Mm-hmm.
the oldest was starting to get to the age where, um, I kind of thought like, well, maybe we can just stay here and adapt to Uruguayan culture and kind of raise our kids here. But middle school and high school is like a really important cultural
Right.
time. And
Yeah.
there was starting to be some like cultural strain, which I love Uruguayan culture, but it's just we're Americans, it's a different culture. And so there was starting to be like some, what am I? I'm like, am I this? Am I that? And I was like, okay, my oldest is on the cusp of middle school and the youngest is out of babyhood. Like, okay, I think this period is done now. And so now we're back.
Mm.
Yeah.
Right. It's like it's a season for everything, right? There was a
Yep.
season in which you were getting your children post 3 years old and
Yep.
maximizing the time, and now you're entering the season of like the their influences are starting to increasingly not be their family, right? It'll be their friends, it'll
Yes,
be their
that's
community, it'll be
right.
their country, and that is a different kind of optimization. And the optimization you chose was these are American children, and they should have
Yep,
American values. So
that's
let's do
exactly
that.
right. And not just American, but like we're both from this neighborhood in Chicago. We have a
Yeah.
bunch of family here, like huge social network, and like just
Mm-hmm.
having them have that experience of like, being young kids riding their bikes around the neighborhood, just like how we were
Mm.
raised and that kind of thing, where we kind of had to decide one way or another. And the Uruguay experience was kind of like a preschool, like it just a
Mm-hmm.
very soft environment to be a very young child in. And then
Mm.
now they're starting to get some autonomy, and I'm like, this is the culture I think they need to get that, like
Yeah.
the from child to young adult period in.
So when I talk to parents who are considering doing some version of what you've done, there's often a concern about returning home, right? Like that community of people I used to be a part of aren't there anymore, or this they'll be perceived as weird in school, or like they'll be
Yeah.
behind, or there's like lots of thoughts. And what were the benefits and pain points of returning, and where do you think maybe those fears are misplaced or actually accurate?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't have, since we came back to Chicago, we're both from Chicago, we came back, once a year, usually for at least a month. And so
Hmm.
it was kind of like splitting time the whole time,
Hmm.
where it was like some portion of our time was in Chicago and portion in Uruguay, so they could maintain a connection to the United States, whether or not we decided to stay in Uruguay. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think part of it is like it's not all just perfectly hunky dory. Like, I think changing kids' schools in the middle of their grade school experience is really tough, and it's asking a lot of them. I went to the same grade school from kindergarten through eighth grade, and there was something really special about that,
Hmm.
and like just being with the same exact cohort from the time you're a little kid. And so, like, my oldest, basically had a whole friend group in Uruguay and was like, grew up with them since the time that she was a toddler, and now had to switch. And now she's got a great friend group and she's making new friends, but it's not like, it's not perfectly easy. I mean, she's a great and resilient kid, and she's super outgoing, and so it hasn't been too hard on her. But it's definitely not a completely neutral decision.
Hmm.
And speaking as a sociologist, if we had an option to do our kind of sabbatical in the US, and still have some ability for both of us to stay home, it's just the cost of living is so much higher.
Right.
It's not possible. But if we had, I don't know, maybe that would be like another alternative universe where like we got to do the sabbatical, we were like radically low downshifted, as a term in sociologists use, like lower your cost of living, lower your total amount of work and spend more time, with your family and have that kind of your sabbatical. Maybe we would have, but yeah, there's trade-offs because just learning Spanish and having 9 acres and, chickens and a little
Mm-hmm.
farm and a homestead and that kind of thing was such a cool experience too. So, and there's just trade-offs with everything. But yeah, switching kids mid childhood is always tough, but my hope is that it will like also kind of teach them some resilience and like being able to adapt throughout life,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, it's so funny. I talked to a parent who they grew up similar to you, K-8, same school. And she was like, I hated it because I was always remembered as whatever I was in second grade.
Right.
Eighth grade.
Well,
Yeah.
that's true. Yeah, that's true
Yeah.
too. But there's like a sense of belonging, like,
Right. There's pros and cons for sure.
yeah,
Right.
right, exactly.
Um, Before I get to the fire conversation, the last thing I want to ask you is, um, I am sure parents in your life have been like, Ashley, this seems dope. I want to do this, but in France, or I want to do this, but in
Hmm.
Mexico, or whatever. What is your advice to them? The things that they may not like are obvious or consider, having done this for a few years.
I've met a lot of families who now over the years, especially like expats in Uruguay who have done this. And I met this one Australian family, and they came from Australia, I think when their kids are like all basically teens and adolescents. And leaving at that point and trying to get them to go to a foreign school in a different language, I think was really, really painful. Really
Mm,
painful at that age.
mm-hmm.
So I think the timing really matters. If you can start thinking about this kind of thing, um, if thinking about your life in seasons, there's no hard and fast rule for anyone. You have to just be thinking about your own family and your own goals and like your own children and their limitations, etc. But like having my kids come when they were 3 and under, that was so much easier to adapt to the
Mm,
foreign culture and language than if I were expecting them to go at like 10 or 12 or 14 or 16 and go to high school and you don't know the language. And like, that's just so, I think it's really painful and will probably live in the memory of those kids as a very painful experience.
mm-hmm.
Alternatively, you can homeschool, and there's like kind of a cultural tension, especially if you're going to a different place with a different language and culture. Like, are you really a part of this community or not?
Right.
If you're kind of like isolated. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Like, I really, really enjoyed being fully all in on the community, going to the community schools, going to all the community events, making a bunch of friends there, like just kind of embedding ourselves fully and being like fully submersed in the culture. But just thinking about timing, like ideally you're having this conversation in your 20s before you get married. Not that
Right.
that's
Right. Right.
perfect for everyone, but like maybe you have a listeners who are thinking about this before or newly married and thinking about this. That's the ideal time, because we bought our land in 2012 and didn't go until 2016. So we
Mm,
had a period of time where we bought the land, had intentions to move, and then decided to get pregnant once we had a plan with
mm-hmm.
the land. Like, this is where we're going to go with our family when they're little, when the kids are little. And then, had to save up enough money. It takes a long time to like, manage these things, and to move internationally.
Yeah, I think there's a theme to what you're describing, which is intentionality, right? Like nothing's perfect. There are trade-offs. There are things you're giving up, but do it on purpose. Is
Yeah,
kind of
do it
like
on purpose. To be intentional about it and try to think like, and don't try to fit a square peg into a round hole. Like, if you're past the season and you're annoyed with American culture and you wish you spent more time with your kids, but they're like 15, 12, and 9, like it might not be the best time to uproot them at that point. At that
mm-hmm.
point, like maybe you need to consider taking family vacations where you spend more time together and you just take mini sabbaticals, and it's like we're
Right.
all going to be together for months at a time and we're going to enjoy ourselves that way. Like, there's not one way to do it where you're like, I want to rekindle these family moments. I also am of the opinion that, for example, like we're in such an amazing period of our kids' lives from 4 to 11. Like, they're so fun at this age. And so
Mm-hmm.
every summer I'm like, we're doing a million things together as a family. We're taking
Yeah.
family vacations. We're going to go see Yellowstone. We're going to go to Yosemite. Like, we're going to give them those magical experiences, because like this is only a short window where they're like this, where they like are
Mm.
going to go with you and you can show them the world.
Yeah, I'm working on this post, which I'm loosely calling the Sabbatical, because there's a bunch of dads I've come across where they're like, I just want to be around from 4 to 11 roughly, and then
Yeah.
I will return to focusing on my career. But right now, this is like the zone I'm in.
The
So
fun, yeah, and that's a
yeah,
great dad zone. 4
yeah,
to 11 is like you can take them with you anywhere. Like, my husband's teaching my oldest how to golf, and he's super into golf, and she's getting into it because he's excited about it. And it's like,
nice.
what a great time to really impart some of your,
Mm-hmm.
fathering in that period.
Mm. Um, let's talk fire. So my, um, a thing I've often thought about fire is like it is a cool introduction to autonomy, and like you don't need to constantly up level your status necessarily if you don't want to. But what I found, my criticism of it is often like, to do what, right? There's all these
Right.
posts of people who are like, I fired, but actually I have no friends because I never went anywhere. I don't have a wife and kids because I was so focused on frugality, and it's like
Yes.
it's incredibly like tragic in the truest sense
Yeah.
that is. And I would love if you could just walk through your kind of mental journey. Maybe it does map to that. Maybe it doesn't.
It
I don't know,
does.
but
It does.
okay.
So, I mean, part of it is like, I think part of the fire thing, it appeals to a type of guy who wants to gamify everything, who
Mm,
wants to like
mm,
win in the game of
mm-hmm.
life. And so they're like, I'm gonna make all this money and then I'm gonna be free. But no one, again, they're not really being that intentional because they're kind of just like following the fire guru who is telling them like, you're gonna finally, it's almost like a Christian ethos,
Yeah,
like
like
you're
you're
gonna
gonna be like
reach heaven.
actualization.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
gonna be in heaven once you've like got to this goal. And the way that we conceptualize it now is like you'll be in heaven once you retire at 65. Like, oh, congratulations, you've retired. And then you see all these people at 65 who are like, I lived for work. Like, I enjoyed actually working and having somewhere to go. And like, I liked the belonging of that. So there's just like a re-updating that needs to happen with like the idea of work in general. I think a couple of things. One, I think we should just have like a much healthier approach to work in general and think of it more as a vocation and not like something that's only a means to an end of making money
Mm,
and then you get to be free from like the chains of it and the bondage, but instead like if at all possible build a vocation that's meaningful and like something you want to be doing with your time. Obviously you have to mix that with something you can make money doing, but and then secondly, I think yes, you're completely right about the fire mentality, and people don't really know what to do with their time. So, of course, when I first learned about this, I was like, I love the idea that you can be I love the idea of frugality first of all because I think people are like way too overly consumeristic. They make more money and then they spend more money and they don't even think about it. They're not thinking
mm-hmm.
about like every hour you spend in your job is like money,
Yeah,
and so you're
yeah,
trading your time for that
yeah.
thing that like might not even be that nice. Some brand new car that you're driving off the lot, and that's your life. You're trading your life for that. And so if I think about it in terms of like the ultimate wealth is freedom of time. And so, but then what are you doing with that time? And so again, it goes back to the intentionality. Then I heard about this concept. I don't even know, it was like a fire adjacent person who was saying mini retirements as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
like retire early, financial independence, retire early. It could be financial independence, take a mini retirement for something. So, like to write a book, to take care of your little
Mm-hmm.
kids, to take care of an elderly parent, these kind of things where like there are periods of time in our lives where we have extra work responsibilities and we don't have time to attend to them or goals in life. Maybe I have this project on the back burner, like I've always wanted to go and work with this guy in Greece and learn how to paint, and I just need the time. Like I've always wanted to do it. It's a lifelong goal of mine. Like save up the money, make everything else work that you're required to do to be able to go away, and then go and take your sabbatical. And like that's
Mm,
the whole idea of a sabbatical from academia is like you
mm-hmm.
have this book you want to research and you need
Yeah, there's an
to
output usually.
you need to get away from the grind. And in my case, the output was infants that were with their mother for
Yeah,
7 years. You know what I
yeah,
mean? The output is human beings, which is like, what else is there? Like that's like
yeah.
the most perfect. I mean, the most impactful thing you can create in life. And so, yeah. So I mean, so I think about it as that. And like I said to you before, it was very intentional until the youngest was
Mm-hmm.
in school age. And the idea, if we stayed in Uruguay, was to like ramp up our work there, whether it was remote work or, we were
Mm-hmm.
hosting students on study abroad programs or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So ramping up that work when the youngest is 3, 4-ish.
Mm. I by the way, I imagine you kept the Uruguay land and you can go back
Yep.
when you. Okay,
Yep.
yeah. That's also cool. The one of the last things I want to ask you is about, you mentioned vocation, right, as a work, and something that I bristle against when people talk about whatever, maybe retirement, sabbaticals, fire, is this like kind of nihilism or cynicism around the idea of like labor or work. The idea that like
Yeah.
it is never a good use of your time. We all should be like hanging with our family or painting pictures or whatever. Like we get
Yeah.
like, and I kind of always bristle against it, and I can never articulate why, but I think you did, which is like, this is a part of your life. Like there's no version of this life which you get away with not working for money.
No, I know. And I
Yeah.
actually think like part of it is that we have like a really weird and disordered conception of what work is, because we only think of things that's wage labor as work. So I think of like the work of my life in a holistic sense, including the care of my children, including
Mm.
taking care of my home, and including things I get paid for, including being around for my family. Like that's all part of the vocation of my
Mm.
life, and they go together and complement each other. But I also think like, yeah, I mean, yes, be a productive member of society. Like, you know
Mm-hmm.
what I mean? Your whole life isn't just to be a consumer or enjoyer of life. Like, contribute something,
Mm-hmm.
if you
Mm-hmm.
have something to contribute, whether it's like the care and raising of children and family members, or plus, things that you write about or things that you make with your hands,
Mm-hmm.
or include, I think people should probably do all of these things, even people whose paid work is like email work, like
Mm-hmm.
learn how to make something, grow some food, you know what I mean? Like do a lot of other types of work, produce something, be productive. Like part of it, I think, is like we do have this orientation toward um like somehow the apex of life is to be a consumer. And I think
Mm-hmm.
actually, no, we should be thinking about ourselves as how can I produce something of value that
Mm-hmm.
will, even if it doesn't persist beyond my life, like
Mm.
what can I add to the world,
Mm. Um, what have I asked you about? What about your journey you think is important that I didn't hit on?
Um, I mean, I think we talked a little bit about it, but I'm very much of the opinion that people, mothers especially, are expected to kind of ignore their own biology.
Mm.
And I think it would be really wonderful if maybe even maybe it's just a bottom up thing. It would be nice if there were like some kind of top down structures in place that allowed mothers to be with their babies more and they felt like empowered in that. But it would be really wonderful if the culture changed to stop thinking, like, this is such a burden on me. This is so scary that it's happening to
Mm.
my body. I don't know what to do with this. But instead, like, I'm creating human life and nourishing human life. Like, this is such a joy that I'm able to do this. Like, it wasn't really until my third baby where I was like, because just the period of adapting to life in Uruguay with two little tiny kids and then having a baby there, by my third, I was like, oh my gosh, I am enjoying this so much. The baby is so wonderful. It's so wonderful to just be here looking at my baby and holding her and like being able to
Mm-hmm.
respond to her. So like, I mean, I think it's not rational really at all, except for it's just an appeal to like thinking about like you should feel empowered by this,
Mm-hmm.
and my husband too, you empowered to be there to hold your kids when they cry, to be there for their first steps.
Mm-hmm.
Both of us think about the power in dad and mom both being in the room when all three of them walked, which
Mm-hmm.
never happens now.
Mm-hmm.
Usually even if one parent is home, the other parent's off working. And so it's like getting to see their first steps and being able to hand off the kids to each other and take breaks and or spend time one-on-one time with each kid. Like um there's just not anything that can replace those moments. And so to me, like that's why was willing to upend, our
Mm-hmm.
entire lives to build around something that made that possible, even though it was like more or less possible 20, 30 years ago, and now seemingly less so. And so I was just like,
Mm.
I don't care, like, to go from the original part of the conversation, like, I don't care what it takes. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
working 6 to 7
Mm-hmm.
away from my
Yeah.
kids. I'm just not going to do it. And so I was just like a totally pig-headed, I'm doing this. And then I did it. And I was like, this is one of the most wonderful
Mm.
things I could have ever done for my family and my own enjoyment in life.
It's really a testament to the among many things about like the value of working odd jobs when you're younger. Like you see different slices of the world, and it like can help shape your worldview. I've like a few versions of that from my life too.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, and I'm a big advocate in that too. Like when you're younger, to try to do odd jobs, like live
mm,
frugally to prove to yourself you can. Like that. One other thing I'll mention before we end is like I think a lot of people get onto this consumer cycle, this treadmill where they're like,
hmm
there are people I know in their 20s who got jobs in finance at like $200,000 a year and think they can't live with less than that amount of money. And it's insane.
hmm
Like, you know what I
hmm
mean? I've never in my life made that amount of money. And I couldn't imagine thinking I needed it. And so, no,
hmm
like being able to teach yourself what you need versus what is super comfortable and a want is super important early in life. And like probably
hmm
even more important than like ramping up all your earnings is to learn how to live frugally because you're going to need that your whole life if you want freedom of time.
Yeah, it's like a comfort level. Like I know I can go back to that. It may not be fun, but I could.
Yeah, right. I would
um,
survive. My
yeah.
family would survive. And actually, some of my fondest memories are we're in
hmm
our Uruguay house. We don't have running water yet. We don't have electricity. We're waiting for the electricity to hook up to the new house that we built. And we're kind of camping in the house. And we got, camp stoves and we've got flashlights and we're in sleeping bags. Like, those are some of my fondest memories, which
hmm
were the toughest material times, quote unquote,
Mm.
but like really fun. We had to survive. We had to make it work, and it was like,
Mm.
great memories.
Mm. I love it.